Hey everyone, welcome to another top 10 list. This week's top 10 list was recommended to me by a subscriber. They said that with all the fake error stuff that I do, I should do a top 10 fake error list. And what I mean by fake errors are these are things that people say are errors, but are not. These are the things that the scammers will use to try to get money out of you, claiming that they're rare and valuable errors when the truth is they are not errors at all. So let's get started. Number 10. A lot of these I'm going to have stacks of, by the way. This are examples of bank teller stamps. Whenever they strap notes, the bank teller will then put a strap around the notes and they will stamp the strap so that they know the date that they were counted, and they can write on there who was counted and they can put their number on there. But sometimes when that strap is on there, they miss, and a portion of that stamp goes on the note. That is not an error, not a printing error at all. I don't care what words you can make out. Those are bank teller stamps. Those are quite common. People will tell you, no, it's a printing error because look, there's actually letters there. Or in some cases, there looks just like black ink around the outsides. No, not an error. Look at this one, not an ink smear. That is clearly a teller stamp that they missed. They went this way instead of this way. It's just not an error. Stamping a note with anything does not increase the value. So when you see notes like these are not errors. They are teller stamps, even if they happen to be from cool places. That is number 10. Number 9. These are not ink smears. Okay? How do I know they're not ink smears? Well, to start with, it's the wrong color. Secondly, most of them go through the paper. Here, green, everybody says as soon as you put anything green on a note, oh, that must be an ink smear. It is not. You can see how it goes through the note there. Please tell me why that little blob of green went through the note, but all this green on the back did not come through this way, because it's not how it works. We usually use oil-based ink on our notes. This was water-based, i.e. a marker. That's why it goes through. Once again, just marker, not worth anything. You're going to see stuff like this all the time on notes, and when you look through, see how it bleeds through? Not an error. So the instant you have bleed through, that's not an error. This is not the right color. As close as it seems, it is not the right color. You get stuff like this, damage to the note. Even when you have black, that is not an error. You can actually feel this on the note. Let's see, more of it right over here. Most of this is tape residue or something other than tape, something sticky, and then dirt gets on there. That's what that is. Red, obviously not used. Here's another example of the black, and if I was to fold it over, look at that, goes right through. That's marker. All of these, not a single one is an error. These are all just circulation damage, more often than not marker. And people say, well, who would do that? And I'm not here to try to explain how any individual mark got there. I'm simply telling you there are millions of ways that mark could have got there. The one way it did not get there was in the printing process. If it did not get there in the printing process, it is not an error. Easy enough. So that is number 9. All of these notes that have marker or whatever on them that are simply not ink smears, they are damage. That's funny that these two just line up perfectly like that. Anyway, number 9, not ink smears, not an error. Number 7. I get people talking about this, and people talk about these so much that there's actually a chapter in the error book about them. They call this a lamination error. And what they are trying to tell you is that the top portion of the note right here is separating from the bottom portion of the note, and that was an error in the paper design. The truth of the matter is that the paper isn't paper, it's a cotton linen blend, so it's technically cloth, and you cannot print on cloth very well. So what they do is they put a coating on the front and a coating on the back. What that does is that forces all of the fibers that got the coating on this side to be stuck together, and it forces all the fibers on this side to be stuck together. But there are fibers in the middle that will not touch either end. When a note gets damaged just right, like this one, I could soak this in water and peel the entire note in half the thin way. And I would then have one note, which was just the face, and one note, which is just the back. And people will tell you that's an error. Explain to me how peeling a note in half is an error. That's not an error. That is not only damage, but it's self-inflicted damage. Some people will like to take these notes and peel them 90% of the way. So now they're still stuck together the last inch on the note, but they're wide open and flapped out because they think that looks cooler and is easier to sell to people, which it is. It is much easier to sell to people because people think that that's a legitimate error. It's not. It's just damage to the note. It has no additional value. That is number 8. Number 7. Speaking of damage to notes, some unscrupulous people will attempt to try to remove the seal. Sometimes they'll try to take this one as well and claim that that is an error. Okay. When you see stuff like that, look at the damage done to the paper. There may not be a seal left here, but if there's any damage at all to the paper, that's not an error. This is a poor example of someone trying to make this into an error, and you can see all the damage they did to the paper itself. Another thing to check is the quality of the back of the paper, because when you feel the back of the paper, you can feel that it's thinner. So yeah, not errors, damage, and the worst kind of damage, it's people trying to make these look like errors. You can see it on this side, and sometimes you'll see it on both. There's actually a magic trick involving moving this to this location here, and I've shown that bill in the past. The hardest part is to remove this, so there are a lot of amateur magicians trying all kinds of different techniques to remove this portion of the seal. It's fairly easy to use a copier to copy the seal and print it on essentially tape, and place that piece of tape right over here, the clear tape, so it looks like the seal had moved. Anyway, you're going to see a lot of notes like this. A lot of it is from people who are trying to imitate that trick and fail in the developmental process. Not an error. That is number 7. Number 6. Along the same lines, here are notes where it's the opposite. The seals themselves are very bright, very dark. The numbers are very dark. All of these are very dark. That's all the third print. On all of these notes, the third print is very dark, and the rest of the note is questionable. Every single one of these. Now, what you have to understand is that the first print, that would be the back of the note, and the second print, George and all of this, is done by pushing the paper into grooves, okay? And when you do that, that raises this entire image up off the page. You can feel it. But then when they do the third print, the seals and the number, that gets stamped into the note. They stamp that in. So if you were to look at the note this way, all of this ink is raised up and all of this ink is pushed in. So if you were to sand off the top layer, all of this would disappear, but this would still be bright. That's essentially what happened to all of these notes. All of these notes, the seals are bright and everything else is trashed. That is not an error. There is an error like that. There is an insufficient printing error, but the way you can tell the difference between insufficient printing errors and notes that are just damaged is the quality of the note. You notice that all of these notes, don't look at the image, look at the paper quality. The paper quality on these notes are trashed, and that's the indication that these are not errors. This happened in circulation. This is most certainly circulation damage. Some of these notes, like this one here, the paper appears very bright, But if you look, the paper is just trashed. This note went through the wash. This note had been cleaned and pressed. This note had been cleaned and pressed. That's why the seals are still dark. This is all faded, but you can look and see all of those wrinkles. Same thing here. Very dark black here, very light black here, but look at the paper quality. If the paper quality is bad, you have to assume it's damage, even if it was an underinking error, because the second you destroy the note like this, now you cannot tell the difference between this note and the actual error. That is why it's so important with these particular notes that they have to be in good condition. If they're not in good condition, you have no way to prove whether it's circulation damage or the actual error. So don't even risk buying these unless they've been graded already or unless they're in really nice condition. I don't know what else to tell you about that. That's the way that you want to think about those. That is number 6. Number 5. These are wet ink transfers. Okay, on the back of the note, the darkest part is actually right here, and these 3 lines in one. That is the darkest portion of ink on the back of a $1 bill. And when that gets printed, sometimes it takes more than 1/10 of a second for the ink to dry. And when that page falls on the next one, you get these wet ink transfers. You can see the round part of the O and the 3 lines for the E very well. And on occasion, you'll see stuff right here on George, which would be part of the N. I've heard people call these scars. It's not, it's a wet ink transfer. This happens on so many different notes. It is a very, very common thing. It's not an error. It's simply the fact that the ink has not had enough time to dry. So no, none of these have any additional value. That's simply a wet ink transfer from one note being placed on top of the next within 1/10 of a second of the actual ink that is raised up being applied to the note itself. So no additional value on these. You're going to hear people say that it is worth something. They are not. That would be number 5. Number 4. Some people will tell you that notes like these have a problem with the paper. This particular one is soaked in baby oil. So if I have it behind a bunch of notes, you can still see through the note. Much like when you hold it like this, if I put it here, you can still see that E right there, right there. That's just baby oil. That's not a problem with the print. But what about some of these other ones? I mean, this one especially, and this one here. That is just a note that got covered in some type of ink. Somebody spilled juice on them. Somebody spilled, a pen broke or a marker broke or whatever. There's so many different ways that this could have happened. The one way it couldn't happen is during the print process. Why? Because if this was an actual ink smear, it would be green ink. It would be the same color green as these serial numbers. You wouldn't be able to actually see the seal or these serial numbers. This one, we don't use purple or gray or whatever color you want to call this. That's just not a color that's used. That wouldn't happen in the printing process. If this was an ink smear, well, this is trying to be black ink. It's not, because you can see through it, so it's water-based, but it should be the same color black as everything that's written here. Since this giant ink smear is over letters that are already black, you shouldn't be able to read or see any of that. So no, that is not an error. This one here, just dirty. Just a really weird color note, but not an error. So yeah, you're going to find notes that are miscolored from circulation damage, but that doesn't mean that they are worth anything. That is number 4. Number 3. Here's a note where we are talking about a slight over-inking on one digit. These numbers are on reels, and sometimes they get worn out. And as soon as they start to wear a little bit, well, that's when it's time to take them out. But as they are wearing, sometimes they're a little thicker. Sometimes some of the ink will dry on there a little bit and give it a weird shape. It's not an error. That's just an indication that it's time to change the wheel. Here's how I know it's not an error. What's the first digit? Did you say 8? Okay. What's the second digit? Did you say 6? How about that third digit? We better take a close look at that one. Nope, that's a 6. Okay, well, since we can all identify it as a 6, why would the BEP pull this note? If they're not going to pull it, they're not regarding it as an error. And if they don't call it an error, it's not an error. That means every single time this happens, it goes into circulation. There are enough problems with notes that required us to have millions of star notes to replace the errors. This is not one of those notes. So no, when you have a slight over-inking there, that's simply an indication that it's time for that wheel to get replaced, not an error. Number 2. All right. This one here has a couple little green dots above all of the digits. What this means is that when they were stamping the notes, that the thing that was stamping on here was slightly off kilter, and you get a slight little green rub. Let me just zoom in so you can see how much additional ink has been added to this note. Hardly anything, okay? People will scream up and down that this is an error. Do I find this neat? Sure. I see like 1 or 2 dots. This one actually happens to have quite a few of them, so it was the most drastic example. So what's this worth? If you're going to tell me this is an ink smear, pick your number. Anybody who wants to swear up and down that this is worth something? Okay. This is an ink smear, and this is still considered a minor to moderate ink smear. So this one is probably in the $100 range. For all of that ink blocking out all of that stuff. That's what an actual ink smear looks like. This is worth $100. What are these little dots worth? Tell me again. As I have this back note here, there is more ink right here than there is here. I mean, I can bring this right up to the letters, and there is still more ink covering these letters here that you wouldn't even notice than there is here. That's $100. You tell me what that's worth. I'm going to go with 0. That's what I'm going to go with, because it's minor, very, very minor splatter. There's no additional value. That has additional value. This would get pulled if it was spotted. And the other thing I want to show you about this note is, you see how dark this is? It does not bleed through because it's an oil-based ink. That's how you know it's real. That's how you know that isn't a marker that someone just took a Sharpie and colored in there, because it did not go through the page. So if this is 100, in this condition, this one might be even up to 300. But what is this? Nothing. That's what it is. That's number 2. And finally this week, number 1. Look at the last digit. See how that's raised up? This is a odometer error or a gas pump error. That's what they call them, or that's what they try to call them, or a rolled digit. You hear all of these little things talking about just because this last digit is slightly higher. That means that the screw on the end that's holding these is slightly loose, so it's moving up a little bit. So what? The reason I say that is because you can see the entire digit. If you can see the entire digit, it's not an error. Sorry, that's not an error. When you hear people talking about those, this is what they're actually talking about. Here is a stuck digit error. And if you look, the digit is up so high that a portion of the digit is missing. When there's a portion of the digit missing, that's when it becomes an error, because at that point you are not clarifying the actual serial number of the note. Sometimes you'll even see a portion of the next note coming up. Sometimes this will happen for the suffix or the prefix. But when that happens, like I said, just because it's raised or lowered a little bit, if you can see the entire digit, that's not worth anything. It's once a portion of that note or a portion of that digit is missing, that's when it starts to have value. So that is my top 10 not errors that everybody seems to call errors. If you learn anything new, go ahead and hit that like button. If you like what you see and you want to see more, please subscribe. Love reading all your comments. Guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.